fix that, but we're live.
Great. All right, welcome everyone. We are on lecture 7 today, and Alex has volunteered to lead us into this chapter. Alex, do you need to share your screen or?
Yeah, maybe. I have a painting I might want to share.
All right.
If I don't speak too much, I'll do it.
I think you should be able to. Oh, actually, Ashton, can you check to see if you can make Alex co-host? Because I don't seem to have the ability.
Do you see the share screen option, Alex?
I'm disabled.
Oh, okay.
As
how about now?
Participant. Yeah, now it will work.
Great.
But I'll wait a bit with that.
Wonderful.
Okay. So, lecture 7. And yeah, quite interesting lecture. For me, I felt it left a few open questions, so hopefully we'll address them today. But Steiner begins again repeating this idea that he has spoken of before about how natural science tends towards abstraction and formalism. And just this quote here that I felt was interesting. He says that the harm in modern time is due above all to the deficient feeling for the reality with which we are bound up with. So this sense of not being bound with reality is quite important. And then the lecture has 2 main themes. So the first theme is very much related to what we have studied before in the philosophy of freedom. And then he will go on to speak about also some ideas about how we can change our concepts about space. But Steiner, relating to sense impressions or percepts and thinking, mental pictures, well, he begins by saying that there are qualitative differences between these 2 aspects. And as he said in the previous lecture, they have been these aspects have been changing throughout the evolution of consciousness, especially after the last ice age. And he goes very much into a phenomenology of thinking, at least how I interpreted it. And he says that for us in our time, thinking is very much the same as the activity of dreaming. And for me, it felt that what he was saying that was that both thinking and dreaming appear to us in a way in which in our consciousness it's difficult to separate ourselves from that activity, even if the content of thinking and the content of dreaming is a bit different. And in contrast to that, sense perceptions, they are experienced more separate from us, as something out there. And they sort of, he had this image of a gulf. So sense impressions sort of come into us from the outside. And then he goes to back in time and saying how in a previous time, even before the last ice age, these 2 aspects were in a way inversed. So we were much more united with the world outside through our sense impressions. And regarding our thinking, they would appear to us as percepts. And this is something that we've also looked into before. And he says somewhere in the middle of the lecture that through this process of metamorphosis from the last ice age to current time, the consciousness of the human being has been led from a dreamlike state into a hardening of bodily nature. And that thinking has become more and more bound to somatic processes rather than sense perceptions. And thereby it distances itself from the outer world. So I think this relates to that quote in the beginning, how we are separated through this, let's say, inevitable process of thinking. We become separate from the outer world. Then he says a little bit about how diurnal or daily and annual rhythms also influenced the human soul and consciousness through this metamorphosis. He says that the daily influences tend to form our conscious picture of the world, while the yearly influences affect our bodily nature. But he doesn't go into that much. So here is one of those open questions, I felt. And he also says that if we take into account the evolution of human nature and consciousness, we can understand how the earth relates to the heavenly bodies and its movements. And again, he doesn't go into this in a lot of detail. But there seems to be an underlying idea that these relationships between the earth and the cosmos are intimately related to the life of the human soul and sense perception and thinking. So I think that's an interesting idea to ponder on. He also says something about the formation of the ego or the I, how self-consciousness has a distinctive quality from dream consciousness when we are awake, and that sharp sense is given us by sense impressions. And that's the point where he starts to speak about the sense organs and how, well, I don't know really if this is something that continues into our time, but he says that it's at that time all the sense organs and sense impressions were interpreted as in the same way as the sense of touch functions. So it was a way for scientists to try to describe how sense impressions work into the human soul. But he criticizes that, and he says that each sense has its own physiology and psychology in a way. And he goes on to say that it is through the eye or the sight organ that our thinking becomes, our rational thinking becomes clear and sharp, because it seems that that's what he argues, that what we receive as sense impressions through the eyes have also sharp forms and sharp and clear contours. Then he says something that could be a little bit controversial, and so I think this would also be interesting to look into. He says that there's a reciprocal relationship between this function of sense impressions, especially the eye, with the process of fertilization or reproduction. So in a way, they work in the same way. And he goes on to say that the female life is the life of fantasy or fancy of the universe, whereas the male is that which forms the contours and sharp outlines. So I think for me, took me a little bit of time to try and understand what he actually meant by this. So I think it would be interesting to look into that together. He speaks a little bit about mathematics and kinematics, specifically to say how in modern science reality is filtered by the particular field of science that studies it, and how that is in a way limiting our understanding of reality. And after that, he goes on to the second theme of the lecture. He starts by questioning Euclidean space and the rigidity of that, of the concept of space that comes with Euclidean space and the fixed 3 dimensions. He says that they are an abstraction provided by our detached relationship to the world. And I think also, I mean, especially me, who've studied a bit of design and do drawing sometimes, it's how I habitually relate to my very near environment. It's a framework, as he says, that it's helpful to do things with the material world. But it goes on to saying that we need to find a more qualitative idea of space. And let's see. So when he starts to investigate that, he brings up this idea of the spine being horizontal in animals and vertical in the human being, and that there's in the formative forces of the spine, there's a polarity between the tail and the head that receives influences from the sun. So, well, he describes how these influences are in one way for the animal and in another way for the human being. Some process there that was also a little bit difficult to follow, I felt, so it would be interesting to discuss that. But basically, I think I'm going to just pass through those details. But basically, I think I felt what he was going into, and then also he was speaking a little bit about what would be the difference between the formative forces in the human spine and the formative forces of the growing plant, because they, in a way, they have the same vector or direction. But he still says that although they have that same vertical direction, it's not the same. It's not, the influences are not working in the same way. And he says somewhere that if we study this in detail, we will come to understand what are the movements that are related between Earth and Sun. So as that would sort of reveal those movements. And for Steiner, these movements are a part of that qualitative mobile space that he mentions, that would be the alternative and more comprehensive understanding of space, different than from Euclidean space. So I don't think I'm going to show that painting, actually. So I leave time for discussion. But it just felt interesting just to wrap this up, how these two themes felt to me that they also had a polarity. So the inner realm of consciousness in the human being and the outer realm of space. Can we find, is there something here in this lecture that is speaking to both of these realms. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, there's a lot here that I think he picks up on in subsequent lectures, but this analogy he draws between fertilization and sense experience, at least in our post-Atlantean phase of evolution, I think I was struggling with that as well, but it seems like he's saying that the female body's relation to the environment is a metamorphosed form of the eye's relationship to the environment, and so sight is a metamorphosed form of fertilization. And I was trying to understand this, and he seems to have a kind of Aristotelian understanding of the relationship between sperm and ovum, where the sperm brings the form and the ovum is just the matter. We might want to, I think, sort of archetypally and qualitatively, we could still hold to that sort of a view, even if biology nowadays would challenge that and totally dismiss it. I don't think we should totally dismiss it. I think there's some qualitative sense in which this is accurate. But if we take this, then the sort of the male sperm gives form to the female ovum in the same way that light gives contour and definition to sight, right? Without the sun's light, objects with definite boundaries wouldn't appear to us. And so I think that's the analogy he's trying to make there. But every sense organ, the 5 outward-facing sense organs at least, would have some similar analogy, and it's not as clear as with the eyes. I tried to extend that to the other senses, but yeah, I just wanted to throw that into the mix. I see Angus's hand. Go ahead.
Good evening, all. Good to see you again. Thanks for that, Alex. It's so nice listening to other people. It's like giving their own summaries and what they highlight. I want to share like 3 thoughts, which are going to lead to 2 questions, one for Carsten and one for Max and anybody else who's like particularly, perhaps Matt as well, particularly hot on Plato and the Greeks. The first is an observation. When we were talking about fantasy and contour lines being brought there, for specific reasons, I've been digging into Greek mythology, and anybody who's remembers the myth of Bellerophon, it's a very interesting myth where he has to slay these monsters, but he can't slay these monsters until he's recruited the help of Pegasus, and Pegasus can be seen as this infinite fantastical abilities, in a way Luciferic in character, but which is absolutely useless to him until he can actually bridle this horse and then use it in combat against the Chimeras and the Amazons, and there was one other that he killed as well. So I think it's really interesting digging into Greek mythology and finding parallels between what is being described here, this fantastical, this ability for fantasy that we have, this creative ability that we have that is in us. We are continually creating these mental pictures in our heads, but which of those ones are actually adequate for describing the clear contoured lines of reality? That's something that only shows itself later. So that was just a thought in the male female aspect that you picked up on there, Alex. So the question to Carsten is this Euclidean, this reference to Euclidean geometry, obviously awakens the question of non-Euclidean geometry, and this is a particularly fascinating area. And if I say anything incorrect here, I'd like Carsten to correct me or add details that he thinks are relevant. But non-Euclidean geometry only really came about because of the 5th postulate of he's gone.
Euclid.
Thank you, of Euclid. That basically he's like, he didn't say this, but we know it as parallel lines as like can never meet, and this gave birth to the whole realm of non-Euclidean geometries. And one way of describing non-Euclidean geometries, it's like there's an infinite number of them, which then sort of like get resolved. So you've got this complete open-endedness, which is, if I give sort of like one example, one's like easy example to understand. So like in standard geometry, it's like we understand that that's like if you've got 2 points and you can only link those by one line. In non-Euclidean or hyperbolic geometry, that is the opposite is true. If you've got 2 points, think of a globe. It's like top and bottom of a globe. Those are 2 points, but they can be linked by an infinite number of lines. This is one example. So I think it's really interesting how he's bringing in Euclidean, and it's like hidden behind that is this idea that non-Euclidean is a completely flexible, non-restrictive way of reframing the world. So I'm because Carsten's like a lot more proficient in mathematics. I'm sure he's got better examples and clearer examples for explaining how that might be relevant to this context of bringing heaven and earth together. So it's like the celestial space. He mentions celestial and the earthly realms. It's like this, yeah. So that was there was also an interesting thing that I picked up there. So when were irrational numbers actually born? Well, it was actually what's his name? Basically, Pythagoras had a student whose name I can't remember at the moment, and he proved that the square root of 2 was an irrational number, and the rumor goes that he had to sort of like be dispatched with, whether or not he was killed or expelled from the community or anything, something like that. History doesn't know. But what I do find interesting from this perspective is the Pythagorean notion is that all is number, and an irrational number is the antithesis or the antithesis to that very proposition, unless you get into infinite fractions, which is a completely different story. So it's interesting, you've got in this mystery school of Pythagoras, it's like somebody coming up and saying, you're saying the whole world is numbers? It ain't. And this is also what Steiner is pointing to, I believe, in this chapter and other chapters. So I'd love it if Carsten could add something there. And then the other point that I'd like to, this is perhaps to Max and anybody else who's really like proficient in ancient Greek thinkers, would be if I happen to be looking at the mystery of in Plato's Republic, and his description of reincarnation is really quite amazing if you relate it to the process of incarnation as like what happens in the different spheres. It's like different imagery, but there's strong parallels to Steiner's descriptions of it, indicating mystery knowledge. And because that's so close, and also because in Thetis, I think it's called, where Plato gets into the theory of knowledge, this also comes very close to Steiner's own work with the philosophy of freedom. I suspect somewhere hidden in Plato or other Greek philosophers will have some clear thoughts on this idea of the qualities of space. I know, but I can't remember the details at the moment. There is this idea of there's a quality which is like direct, which is linked to the vertical. There's a quality and it's described, but as I said, I can't remember the details for the horizontal, and there's a quality for the forward and the backwards in there. And I was thinking, Max, because we've had a few conversations together, you might be able to add something in that direction. Something might come to mind there. So a long list of things I chucked out there. But yeah, look forward to hearing your responses.
Thanks, Angus. A lot there. I'll let Lorenzo chime in, and then we can circle back to those various topics you introduced.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I wanted to say that, to my understanding, an irrational number is not really outside of mathematics. It's part of mathematics. We would have no other way of talking about an irrational number apart from mathematics. And just as irrational numbers, so complex numbers, quaternions, and whatever, it's true that the Pythagorean model was put in crisis by the discovery of irrational numbers. Still, I think that's something that has more to do with logics than with mathematics, because irrational numbers give us problem with the principle of identity, and they we cannot say anymore that the world is made of numbers if we get things like irrational relationships inside the kind of logic we are used to. But still, that's mathematics. It's like the difference in ideal philosophy between intellect and reason. We actually we call irrational numbers, but that's very unfortunate, because it would be able to differentiate between the rational numbers, calling them intellectual numbers, and the irrational numbers, calling them as rational numbers, since we are things that we see, that we have an intuition of, like the square root of 2. That's the diagonal of the square. So it's something we our reason actually grasps very well, but it's our intellect that cannot do the same, because the intellect is discrete and works on the logical level with a discrete model of identity. And so that's the real difference, in my opinion. There's an anthroposophist.
Can I just talk to that point, Lorenzo, see if I'm understanding you correctly? Because I think you're giving us like a specific. There's a specific understanding of the word rational and irrational in the way you've described it there, which I don't think is relevant to what's going on here. It's a ratio of numbers which makes it irrational. These numbers cannot be described as ratios between other numbers. Then that's got nothing to do with whether it's intellectualizable or rational, reasonable.
No, I disagree, because that's the problem of continuity. The real line is what gives us the continuum, while the rational numbers cannot do that. So this is deeply linked with intuition and intellect. It's the very same difference. It's what Peirce would differentiate between a secondness and thirdness. That is, we can think about the relation between things as things themselves. So we can, take the square root of 2 as a thing in itself, and in fact we do see it. We have an intuition of that. We have an intuition of the continuum, but we cannot intellectualize the continuum, because our intellect only deals with discrete quantities. And this is in my opinion, at least, and I've been studying the subject very much, it's really the same division between intellect and reason that Kant or Hegel dealt with. In fact, Peirce was actually trying to reframe those very categories with secondness, thirdness, and thirdness in a way that could relate them more directly to mathematics. And that's why he used diagrams, which once again, they are visual. And so they have irrational numbers in them, what philosophically we would call reasonable intuition, because you see two dimensions at once. While in language, which is what intellect works with, you get one dimension, and that's why you are caught with a kind of intuition that has no irrational numbers, because you have only one dimension, and inside one dimension you will never get an irrational ratio, an infinite ratio. What you get irrational numbers from are always geometrical entities, like pi or phi from all, and that's intuition. It's the same problem. We get from intuition. From intuition, we get geometry, and we get all these domains of mathematics, which go beyond our intellect, which is linear and and can only work with discrete quantities. We have the intuition of continuity, but when we discuss it, when we think about it, we can only express it through discrete quantities.
So you're linking that to when Steiner talks about creating clear contours, it's like with rational numbers, everything that's divisible, and gives an accurate reflection, that's a clear contour. But as soon as you get into the irrational numbers, those contours disappear.
You cannot calculate.
Yeah, exactly.
You can point to the square root of 2, but you cannot really calculate that. You cannot calculate pi, you cannot calculate phi, only approximations. And I think it's really the same problem. But I just wanted to close with this consideration that another anthroposophist who wrote later than Steiner, Ernst Lers, who wrote a wonderful book called Man or Matter, which is kind of expansion of these lectures on astronomy we are reading now, because it's really looking at the history of physics through the eyes of Steiner, and through this idea of different geometries, counter space, and anyway, it's a very beautiful book. I recommend it to everybody. And Ernst arrives at this conclusion regarding mathematics, that actually the problem is not really mathematics, but the kind of mathematics that we have. And I kind of agree, because I think that even when Steiner tries to argue that we should get away from mathematics, everything that he says actually is still mathematical. It's just an expansion of mathematics. And I think that he maybe had a slightly more rigid idea of mathematics than the one we have today, and that there are projects of new mathematics that, in my opinion, could reconcile the Pythagorean model and the kind of distinctions that Steiner is making when he's pointing to the fact that when we work with our reason intellect, trying to describe facts using certain numbers, then our answers are completely determined by the characteristics of those numbers. But I think his critique, to be more precise, should be a critique against those number domains which are incomplete regarding to the whole that we are trying to deal with, and not with mathematics per se. I think just that new number domains is what we should look for, and that it's much more interesting to see the divisions that Steiner is pointing to as division through between number domains, and not really as pro or against mathematics. That's at least the opinion that I've matured during the last years, and I see that this is something that's been discussed in anthroposophy, and so it's not just my opinion, it's something that is there in on the table. Thank you.
Karsten, I assume you have comments to address everything we've been discussing, so please.
Yeah, I don't think I can add much to what Lorenzo just said. One thing is, Aston mentioned it in the chat as well, that I think Steiner here is pointing towards a more kind of qualitative mathematical analysis. So he's not talking about non-Euclidean formal systems. That's one point. And I also agree with Lorenzo that this has to do with the analysis of the concept of continuity. And I know about Peirce's analysis too, and his criticism of Kant and Kant's concept of infinity. For example, the idea that a line is made out of points, where Peirce makes the analysis that we should conceive a line as something that is made of small line elements, which again are made of even smaller line elements, and so on ad infinitum. And also there is Cantor's analysis of the concept of infinity, which touch upon this concept of irrational numbers, because when you have the real numbers, it turns out that you can prove that even though natural numbers or rational numbers, there's an infinite amount of them, there's still a change, some kind of qualitative difference between real numbers and rational numbers that can be put one-to-one in a line. So they're real numbers are not countable, or they cannot be organized in some kind of pattern. And I think the problem we have here, and Lorenzo also touches upon this, is that when we talk about continuity, we're actually talking about the deepest core of our very own being. And that's why we cannot distance ourselves enough to continuity and what it means, because it's really what we are at the very deepest level. We are infinite, eternal beings, and that's what we are somehow being taught through mathematics and through this mathematical analysis of the concept of continuity as it's made, for example, by Peirce or Cantor. Yeah, that's all I had to say.
Yeah, I did take note of Steiner's mention of Minkowski and this sort of four-dimensional geometries that Einstein was making use of to specifically indicate that that's not the sort of qualitative approach to the study of space that he was trying to gesture toward. I think Lorenzo's understanding of the various approaches to geometry and how they apply here is far in advance of mine, but I was thinking that Steiner's speaking here of projective geometry in an attempt to describe a kind of etheric space, right? That would be what distinguishes, say, the verticality of the human form from the verticality of the plant form. It's not something you would perceive if you're just thinking in terms of a metrical geometry. But how to put astronomy, contemporary astronomy, on this new basis and in terms of a qualitative approach to mathematics seems very difficult. As Steiner says, we're at the beginning of this chapter, we're addicted to abstraction, and our very concept of explanation requires it. And so to engage in astronomical science without trying to quantify and calculate would seem, I think, for most astronomers today to be to to leave science itself behind, right? And so there's a major challenge here to shift our concept of what it would mean to explain the motions of the heavens by bringing human nature back into the picture. It's, when I think the challenge of trying to explain this methodology Steiner's laying out for us to, your average astronomer today is immense, I think. What do you think, Gopi?
Yeah, I think even with Euclidean geometry, the way Steiner approaches it is very different in general regarding the movement. He asks us to bring everything into movement. For example, you take a triangle and mentally you shift around the different lengths and you constantly transform from the I don't know, equilateral to the right angle and scaling and all these things which we learn in a static way and get them moving. That was one exercise given. But if you push that activity to its limit, what happens when the triangle opens right up until it almost looks like that? And then that's when you have projective geometry, because it flips over and comes back from the other side, and you can see it from the movement of the lines themselves rather than any particular theory. And that's the root of Minkowski and Einstein and all of that, is you have rigid rods, as like everybody's coming with a set of rigid rods at right angles with each other. They come with that, and they just stick another rod somewhere over there mentally in order to account for time. So there is no movement. You have rigidified time as well with Minkowski in terms of how we deal with it conceptually or internally. So that's a big one. I think that's what happens when we are trying to push the boundaries, not merely like in a theoretical way, but we are trying to experience our way into it. That would be my take on it. And there's something related to this lecture, another point that I wanted to mention. Again, it is the sense question, which you mentioned. It's going to come back. I think it's going to come back either in the last lecture or the last but one lecture, about how the sensation process relates to the Earth and the Sun again. So there is another view of that, which I think will shed even more light onto what he put down here as masculine and feminine. And the last point I wanted to say is this kind of very interesting discussion of head and tail. And what is the drawing here, figure 3, right? Not figure 2, where you have just a rough outline of the animal. But if you look at the drawing figure 3 and he points to the sun and the earth, the animal as such, it still looks like the face is at 90 degrees to the sun. If you think about it in terms of how an animal is during daytime, you have the earth, you have the sun, and the animal is horizontal along the surface of the earth. It's still pointing that way or that way. It's not pointing towards the sun or away from the sun. And it doesn't do that until you have, the earth and the sun, and the animal it's on the twilight level. When you have, the time when it's sunset or something, that's when you have the animal either facing towards the sun, looking at the sunset, or away from the sun, either way. So that's one interesting point. That's how it looks geometrically. That's the only way you can directly see the animal pointing towards the sun. But in addition, you also have the interesting quality of fur in the lion, in the fur, the hair, and all of that, which is predominantly coming in this region. almost like the rays of the sun for the animal structure in general. So this is just a speculation. I'm thinking that is one of the directions through which he's probably pointing to the relationship of the sun to the face for the animals. And I don't know yet what has triggered the relation of the through the sun process to the tail yet, but the front part is, it feels quite clear. It is true also, but the tail is also another region which generally has hair. You know, you have the front having hair and the tail having some hair in many animals, not all, of course. It's, again, it's just a structural thing which I wanted to mention to trigger further thought.
Yeah, as with many of the suggestions Steiner makes, I can sometimes grasp the general principle, just as he says, embryology and celestial movements are intimately related. And so, yeah, the morphology of animals and human beings and plants is going to be something that's not just locally determined by the way that cells, decide how to grow, but there's this deeper synchronization with cosmic rhythms. But then Steiner's very specific about how these celestial movements are shaping the specific forms of organisms, and it's difficult to grasp exactly the type of relationship he's suggesting. But as he says, he's giving us some hints and guideposts here to do further research.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's exactly right. Eyes are in the front, but the fertilization function is at the back. That's super critical. Yeah, because you have the Goethe's statement: the sun makes the eye, for itself, so to speak. So you have that right there.
And I'm thinking about the diurnal annual relationship there too, where the sense organs on the head have, at least in the human, more to do with daytime consciousness, whereas the somatic and perhaps even the reproductive powers, which, it's not exactly a year, it's 9 months of gestation in the human, but there's something that longer time period is closer to an annual cycle, to, thinking about the metamorphosis from the senses to the processes of fertilization and reproduction. It's a much longer rhythm for reproduction than it is for our sense experience, which every time the sun rises comes online. Karsten, is your hand up again, or? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, when we discuss, say, the usefulness of these formal systems or not, we should not only consider whether they describe reality, but we should also consider what they do to our thinking process, how they kind of affect our thinking process. And I think Steiner perhaps is thinking about that as well. But so if I give an example, if you have this traditional concept of a line as being composed out of points, then your thinking process actually comes to a stop. It's when you kind of reach the point that has no extension, everything stops. There's no more to think about. Whereas actually, if you have this concept that Peirce introduced, that a line is composed of line elements, which are again composed of even smaller line elements, and so on ad infinitum, you can actually go on with the thinking process. It will never stop somewhere. And it's the same if you have kind of, say, atomistic worldview. So you have you have the idea of an elementary particle somewhere. What would it mean for our thinking process if there actually were such things as elementary particles that could not be decomposed into even smaller elements? Well, it would be the same thing. It would be a stopping point for our thinking process, for our spiritual, say, involvement with the world. So that's one of the reasons why I favor this idea that basically there is always motion underlying any kind of particle that we see. That so at an earlier meeting, I made this suggestion that when we see physical objects, they're actually macroscopic variables. So there's some kind of microscopic world underneath, and that goes on infinitely. It never stops. I think this kind of worldview, whether it's true or not, it's much more exhilarating to think about, because it kind of allow you to open up and get deeper and deeper into reality. So somehow we'll never get bored this way. Whereas if we have these elementary particles, that is kind of the idea in most materialistic worldviews, then we just come to a stop. It's just at some point it's just a full stop, and there's no more things to think about. I wouldn't like to be in a universe like that.
Yeah, I like this idea that there's no ground floor. And it's Steiner repeats it a few times in this chapter, and it's sort of one of the main principles of Goethean science that, ultimately we don't want to rest satisfied with any hypothesis. We're trying to return to the phenomena and view any hypothesis, any model that would explain the phenomena as a kind of placeholder, a scaffolding that can, support us as we continue to penetrate deeper into our experience. And I see so much. There's this opportunity right now in physical cosmology for not just a new model to take the place of the old models, whether it's the models of particle physics or the Big Bang model. They're all in crisis. And the usual response is, oh, well, we just need a better model. But I feel like there's this opportunity now, if this Goethean approach to science can be articulated in a way that gets the attention of scientists, that they can shift their whole methodology here away from this pursuit of another hypothesis, which could only ever be a placeholder for genuine knowledge. So rather than replacing one abstract model with another abstract model that might account for a few more of the anomalies that are being observed and measured, we could engage in a more participatory relationship with the phenomena. And so it's an exciting time, though I'm still at a loss to understand how to effectively communicate this approach to, and maybe it's not possible. Maybe we need alternative institutions rather than trying to communicate to existing scientists and astronomers.
Ashton, what do you have to say?
Well, I don't have anything to say at the moment. Is there anything specifically you'd like me to speak to?
I just thought you were mentioning a few things about the sun and the metabolic activity and so on. If you had anything more on that.
Well, I guess, maybe it's not so clear what I meant. I think I was just thinking as I was reading this that, this reference to the sun passing through the earth as having like that influence having a correspondence with the hind just made me think of the night and the influence of the sun passing through the earth, which Steiner will draw correspondences between the metabolic limb system and the earth, whereas he draws a connection between the sun and the cosmos beyond the earth with our head and sense system. So yeah, I was just thinking about it that way, and also just thinking about it like in this mobile way. He says like we just sort of abstractly impose these axes, but if you like put yourself horizontally, you kind of get a sense for the qualitative difference between being vertical and if you like put yourself on all fours like an animal. But yeah, just imagining like, day after day, form being molded through this kind of symphonic activity of the Earth-Sun relationship, but as well, he's not even mentioning the other planets and whatever else might come into this, but those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, it's since we are on the subject of geometry and planets, I don't know if you guys have heard or read about Steiner's indications in the lectures to workmen about the Earth's shape being a rounded off tetrahedron. And not out of that. That's really something. I'll while we go on, I'll pull up the link and put it on here. But that again blows your mind from a completely different direction. Of course, in 2016 or something was when the whole flat Earth model conquered the internet. It was just like overnight, boom, some floodgate open and the internet was blasted with the flat Earth. But now, when you look at what Steiner was describing, he's describing the mountain ranges as coming towards the edges of the tetrahedron, and the rest, he says, not like literally a tetrahedron, but it's rounded off with the tetrahedron as a basic shape that it is getting rounded off from. And that I have a couple of links to that, because that does align beautifully well with the continental formations of current day Earth. So yeah, it's not just the ordinary shapes that we take for granted. It's everything gets revamped as you're going through this stuff. So yeah.
Awesome. I'll look forward to exploring those links. Well, Angus, would you like to have the last word before we close?
Only in the sense of a question. Whilst Matt was asking his question about connecting these ideas to astronomers, I was thinking about Carsten's description there about what matter is subdivisible. But if you go from the opposite direction, which is like everything is perturbations of the quantum field, then perhaps these qualities are actually already in some way described in the quantum field. I feel that's something that Gopi might be able to talk to. I'm not sure whether there's any description of qualities in that realm. Are you aware of that type of thing, Gopi?
I'm sorry, I kind of lost it because I was looking for the lecture. Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so I was thinking about in terms of looking for qualities in the quantum field, because everything, it's like matter all sort of like emerges as perturbations in the quantum field. Do they talk about qualities within that realm?
Oh, in the quantum realm?
Yeah.
Not really. Quantum realm has become a kind of bankrupt of qualities, and all you have are pure statistics. And they're trying to replace the qualities, and obviously, having removed them and thrown them out the window, you can't bring them back by using number juggling. So in quantum mechanics, it's lost. Quality is just
well, there's generally this in physics, this concept of a field, which is kind of the shadow of qualities, because and also of waves. I mean, if qualities are adjectives and they cannot exist because we only think of substances as existing, then the adjectives are treated as fields, while the verbs are treated as waves. So there's this talk in physics, not just quantum physics, but all physics about waves.
I was thinking,
and
for example,
fields.
you often hear talk about like spin. as opposed to perhaps some other which like typically manifests itself in a certain way. But I hear what you're saying. It's only talked of in terms of matter, so like to describe it. But I was wondering if so that this idea of direction, up, down, left, right, backwards, forwards, but there's nothing there.
Yeah, we'll have to bracket it for now because I have a meeting that I have to go to. But thanks so much, everybody, for being here. And we'll see. Actually, forgot to mention, we're going to be on a retreat with our philosophy program next week. So we'll have to skip meeting next week, but we'll meet the following week, same time.
Okay.
See y'all.